In the scenic foothills of Colorado, a 58-year-old retired accountant was about to discover the true meaning of family betrayal. What began as an ordinary email check turned into a moment of devastating clarity when Marcus Reynolds stumbled upon vacation photos of his entire family at the mountain cabin he had purchased 20 years ago, a gathering to which he had never been invited. Their smiling faces told a story of calculated exclusion that would set in motion an unexpected reckoning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Reynolds wasn't your typical grandfather. For 35 years, he had supported his family through meticulous financial planning and selfless generosity, known for his quiet determination and unwavering loyalty. When he encountered the digital evidence of his deliberate exclusion, he had no idea he was uncovering a pattern of disrespect that stretched back years. Marcus's decision to reclaim his dignity would lead to a family confrontation that exposed decades of entitlement and manipulation. What began as a painful revelation became a journey of empowerment and shocking family realignment. The computer screen flickered as Marcus scrolled through the Facebook photos, each image driving the painful truth deeper like splinters under his skin. The Reynolds family vacation album, filled with sunsets over the mountain lake, bonfires on the shore, and his 4 adult children with their families gathered around the large wooden table on the deck of his cabin. His cabin. The property he had purchased after years of careful saving, the dream retirement spot he had built with his own hands after retiring from the accounting firm where he'd worked for 3 decades. Family traditions matter, read the caption under a photo of his eldest son Brian raising a toast. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he clicked through image after image, searching for any mention of himself, any acknowledgement of his absence. Any indication that he had been invited but somehow missed the message. Nothing. Marcus sat back in his desk chair, the weight of realization settling over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a last-minute gathering. The photos showed luggage, planned activities, coordinated outfits for the annual family photo, an annual tradition he had apparently been excluded from for the first time in 20 years. The pain came first, sharp and immediate like a physical blow. Then confusion, as his mind scrambled to find an explanation that wouldn't shatter his understanding of his place in his own family. Perhaps there had been a miscommunication. Perhaps the invitation had gone to his spam folder. Perhaps. But the evidence was undeniable. The vacation had been planned for weeks, maybe months. And no one, not one of his 4 children, had thought to include their father. Marcus made himself a cup of coffee and moved to the living room of his modest Denver condo. The space was impeccably organized, reflecting his lifelong attention to detail and order. The walls were lined with family photos, graduations, weddings, births of grandchildren, moments where he had been not just included but central. When had that changed? When had he become optional? The practical part of his brain, the part that had analyzed financial reports and tax regulations for decades, began assembling facts, looking for patterns he might have missed. The Christmas gathering where conversations stopped when he entered the room. The grandchildren's birthdays where he was invited at the last minute. The increasing frequency with which his offers to host family events were politely declined. He reached for his phone, then hesitated. What would he say? How does a father ask his children why they no longer want him around? The phone felt heavy in his hand as he scrolled through his contacts to Brian's number. His eldest son had always been the family organizer, the one who coordinated gatherings and kept everyone connected. Brian answered on the 3rd ring, the noise of children playing audible in the background. The cabin. He was still at the cabin. Dad. Hey, what's up? Brian's voice carried the slightly too bright tone of someone who's been caught off guard. I was just checking in, Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. Seeing what everyone's been up to. A slight pause. Oh, you know, same old. The kids have summer activities, Sarah's busy with her new project at work. Nothing exciting. The lie hung between them, as tangible as if Brian had reached through the phone and slapped him. Marcus could hear his grandchildren laughing in the background, could picture the lake sparkling behind the cabin's large windows. Sounds nice, Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. I saw some photos online. The cabin looks good. Another pause, longer this time. When Brian spoke again, his voice had shifted into what Marcus recognized as his damage control mode. The same tone he used when explaining business expenses to clients. Oh, that. Yeah, we just decided to take the kids up for a quick weekend. Very last minute. Barely worth mentioning, really. All 4 of your families managed to coordinate a last-minute trip? Marcus kept his tone conversational, though something cold was settling in his chest. Well, we've all been talking about wanting to use the cabin more. You're always saying we should take advantage of it. Brian's voice took on a slightly defensive edge. And we knew you've been busy with your volunteer work at the community center. Marcus looked around his empty condo, at the calendar on his wall with its blank spaces. At the fishing gear he'd been hoping to use at the cabin this summer, still packed neatly in the closet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I see, he said simply. Dad, it wasn't a big deal. Just a casual thing. We would have invited you if we'd thought you'd be interested. The excuse was so transparent that Marcus almost laughed. For 20 years, the family vacation at the cabin had been his favorite tradition. He was the one who stocked the refrigerator beforehand, who made sure the boats were maintained, who remembered everyone's favorite activities and snacks. Of course, Marcus said. Well, I should let you get back to your casual weekend. Enjoy the cabin. He hung up before Brian could respond, before his own emotions could betray him. The silence of his condo enveloped him, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, a retirement gift from his colleagues at the accounting firm. Marcus sat motionless, processing this new understanding of his family dynamic. It wasn't just about a vacation. It was about what the exclusion represented, a fundamental shift in how his children viewed him. Not as the center of the family, not even as an essential part of it, but as an obligation. An afterthought. The doorbell rang, startling him from his thoughts. Through the peephole, he saw Eleanor Simmons, his neighbor from across the hall. In her 70s and widowed for nearly a decade, Eleanor had become a friend in the 5 years since Marcus had moved into the building after selling his large family home. I brought you some of that sourdough bread you liked, Eleanor said when he opened the door. Her keen eyes took in his expression immediately. What's wrong? Marcus considered deflecting, offering some platitude about having a headache or being tired. But something about Eleanor's direct gaze made such evasion seem foolish. Would you like to come in for coffee? He asked instead. Over the next hour, Marcus found himself telling Eleanor everything. About the cabin he had purchased 20 years ago as a family gathering place. About the traditions they had built there, fishing competitions, hiking adventures, nightly board games on the big wooden table. About discovering the vacation photos. About Brian's transparent lies. Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands cupped around her coffee mug, her expression thoughtful. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a long moment. What hurts the most, he admitted in the silence, is that none of them even thought it was wrong. They didn't forget to invite me, they actively decided not to. And they don't seem to think that's a problem. What are you going to do? Eleanor asked finally. Marcus realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. His mind had been so consumed with understanding what had happened that he hadn't considered his response. I don't know, he said honestly. Confront them? Pretend it didn't happen? Neither option feels right. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. Marcus, I've known you for 5 years now. I've watched how you light up when your grandchildren visit. How you rearrange your schedule whenever one of your kids needs something. How you never miss a birthday or graduation or dance recital. Marcus nodded, uncertain where she was going with this. And I've also noticed, she continued, how often you're the one giving and they're the ones taking. How you're always available but they're always busy. How you make the effort to stay connected while they seem to assume you'll always be there regardless. Her words hit with the force of truth, articulating patterns he had sensed but never fully acknowledged. When David died, Eleanor said, referring to her late husband, I learned something important. People will treat you exactly as you train them to treat you. I had spent 40 years accommodating everyone else's needs and wants. After he was gone, Dad, wait, we can talk more after you've had some time to process this. Right now, I don't think either of us has anything productive to add to the conversation. After hanging up, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone. He had expected anger, perhaps even hurt. But Brian's reaction had been primarily focused on the financial implications, both the loss of the property and the missed commission opportunity. Not once had he genuinely acknowledged Marcus's feelings or the disrespect inherent in excluding him from the family gathering. The phone rang again almost immediately. This time it was Jessica, his second eldest child and only other daughter besides Sarah. Unlike Brian, who had followed Marcus into finance, or Sarah, who had become a teacher, Jessica had pursued a career in corporate law. She was precise, analytical, and occasionally ruthless in her assessment of situations. Dad, she began without preamble. When he answered, Brian just called me. Please tell me you're not actually selling the cabin. Hello to you too, Jessica. Yes, the cabin is on the market as of yesterday. Without consulting any of us? Without even a family discussion? Her lawyer's voice was in full effect, sharp and accusatory. I wasn't aware I needed family consensus to make decisions about my own property. Dad, that cabin isn't just your property. It's our family gathering place. It's where we've celebrated every major holiday for 20 years. It's where Mark proposed to me, for God's sake. You can't just unilaterally decide to sell it without even talking to us. Marcus considered his daughter's argument, recognizing the emotional manipulation beneath the logical presentation. Jessica was skilled at framing personal preferences as objective facts, at presenting her desires as the only reasonable position. Jessica, I purchased that property with my own money. I've paid the taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs for 20 years. I've never asked any of you to contribute financially. Legally and ethically, it is entirely my decision whether to keep or sell it. This isn't about legalities, Dad. It's about family consideration. About respecting each other's emotional attachments to places and traditions. The irony of her argument wasn't lost on Marcus. I'm curious, Jessica. Where was this concern for emotional attachments and family consideration when all of you decided to use the cabin last weekend without inviting me? A brief silence. Brian said that was a last-minute thing. Very casual. Did he also tell you that when I called him during this casual gathering, he lied about where he was? That none of you mentioned the trip to me before, during, or after? That I only discovered it because of photos posted on social media? Another pause. Dad, if your feelings were hurt, this isn't about hurt feelings, Jessica. It's about respect. About recognition of the relationship between generosity and gratitude. For 20 years, I've made that property available to all of you without restriction. I've accommodated your schedules, your preferences, your needs. And somehow, over time, that generosity has been reframed as entitlement, to the point where you felt comfortable using my property while excluding me from the gathering. No one was trying to exclude you, Jessica insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. It was just easier to coordinate among the four of us since we all live closer to each other. Marcus almost laughed at the transparency of the excuse. His condo was closer to the cabin than either Jessica's or Michael's homes. Proximity had nothing to do with it. Jessica, I need to go. Walter is expecting my call about the showing schedule. Dad, wait. At least promise you'll consider family bids if you're serious about selling. Michael and I have been talking about possibly buying the place ourselves if you really want to unload it. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Michael and Jessica had been talking about buying the cabin, which meant they had discussed the possibility before, perhaps many times. Had they been waiting for him to die? Or simply waiting for an opportunity to acquire the property they clearly felt entitled to? I'll keep that in mind, he said neutrally. We can talk more later. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had received calls from all four of his children. Sarah had been tearful, Michael indignant, Jessica analytical, and Brian increasingly desperate as the reality of the situation settled in. None of them had offered a genuine apology. None had acknowledged the fundamental disrespect of their actions. All had focused primarily on the impact the sale would have on them, on their traditions, on their expectations. Eleanor stopped by around 5, carrying a homemade casserole and a concerned expression. I saw your son in the lobby earlier, she said as Marcus invited her in. The tall one with the expensive suit. Brian, is it? He didn't look happy. Marcus sighed, setting plates on the table for both of them. None of them are happy. The cabin listing went live yesterday, and they're just now realizing I'm serious. Eleanor served the casserole, settling into the chair across from him. And how are you feeling about it all? Marcus considered the question carefully. Conflicted, he admitted. Part of me feels guilty, like I'm being petty or vindictive. But another part feels, I don't know, validated, maybe? Their reactions have been exactly what I feared, all about their loss, their convenience, their expectations. Not one of them has genuinely acknowledged how hurtful their actions were. That's because acknowledging it would require them to change their behavior going forward, Eleanor observed, her voice matter of fact. It's easier to frame you as overreacting than to admit they've been taking you for granted. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the spicy aroma of Eleanor's famous chicken casserole filling the kitchen. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Denver skyline, painting the buildings in hues of gold and amber. What will you do with the money? Eleanor asked finally. From the cabin sale? Marcus hadn't allowed himself to think too concretely about that yet, half afraid he might still change his mind. But Walter had texted earlier to say they already had 3 showing requests for tomorrow and 2 more for the weekend. The reality of the sale was quickly becoming inevitable. I'm not sure, he admitted. Part of me wants to do something completely unexpected. Something just for me, with no consideration for anyone else's preferences or needs. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Like what? Marcus smiled, a speculative expression crossing his face. I've always wanted to spend a few months in Italy. Rent a villa in Tuscany. Take cooking classes. Learn the language. Drink wine overlooking vineyards. That sounds wonderful, Eleanor said, her eyes lighting up. Why haven't you done it before? The question was simple but profound. Why hadn't he? The answer came immediately, because he'd always prioritized being available for his family. For birthdays and school events and holiday gatherings. For emergencies and celebrations and ordinary weekends. He had structured his entire retirement around being accessible to his children and grandchildren, never considering that they might not value that accessibility as much as he assumed they did. I guess I always thought my primary value to my family was my presence, he said slowly. That being available whenever they needed me was the most important contribution I could make. Eleanor's expression softened. And now? Now I'm wondering if I did them, and myself, a disservice by being so endlessly accommodating. If maybe we'd all be better off if I'd established clearer boundaries from the beginning. The phone rang again, interrupting their conversation. Michael's name flashed on the screen, and Marcus felt a familiar tension headache beginning to build behind his eyes. Do you need to get that? Eleanor asked. Marcus studied the phone for a moment, then deliberately turned it face down on the table. No, he said with a certainty that surprised him. I don't think I do. The evening passed quietly, Eleanor staying for dessert and coffee before returning to her own apartment across the hall. After she left, Marcus found himself drawn to his study, to the filing cabinet where he kept important documents. The deed to the cabin was there, along with maintenance records, insurance policies, and property tax statements. But so was something else, a folder labeled Travel Dreams that he'd started nearly a decade ago, in the early years of his retirement. Inside were brochures for Italian cooking schools, printouts of Tuscan villa rentals, notes about language classes and walking tours. Dreams he'd collected but never acted upon, always deferring to the more immediate demands of family availability. He spread the materials across his desk, memories washing over him. He'd been so excited about these possibilities once, had spent hours researching options and imagining himself living abroad, even if just for a few months. When had he set those dreams aside? When had he decided that his own desires were less important than his constant availability to his children? The cabin sale would generate enough money to fund this dream several times over. He could spend 6 months in Italy, return to Denver for a while to reconnect with friends, then perhaps explore another destination. Spain, maybe. So there's nothing we can say or do to change your mind? Brian asked, his tone suggesting he found this difficult to believe. Brian had always been confident in his ability to negotiate favorable outcomes. I'm not saying that, Marcus replied. I'm saying that meaningful change requires more than words offered in the moment of consequence. It requires genuine recognition of patterns that have developed over years, and commitment to substantive change going forward. What kind of change? Michael asked, seeming genuinely puzzled. What exactly are you asking for, Dad? The question struck Marcus as both sincere and revealing. His children truly didn't understand what they had done wrong or what needed to be different. They had become so accustomed to his unconditional accommodation that they couldn't identify the boundary they had crossed. I'm not asking for anything specific, Marcus said after a moment. I'm establishing a boundary. For decades, I've made myself and my resources endlessly available to all of you without condition or limitation. That ends now. Going forward, my time, my attention, my financial support, all of it will be offered based on mutual respect and reciprocity, not obligation or expectation. A heavy silence settled over the room as his children absorbed his words. For some of them, Brian and Jessica particularly, this represented a fundamental shift in their understanding of their relationship with their father. For others, Michael and Sarah, there seemed to be genuine confusion about why such a shift was necessary. I think we should go, Jessica said finally, her lawyer's instinct recognizing when further argument would be counterproductive. We all need time to process this conversation. The others nodded in reluctant agreement. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions, sadness for the relationship he had believed existed, determination to establish healthier patterns going forward, and a surprising sense of lightness. As if setting this boundary had lifted a weight he hadn't fully recognized he was carrying. Dad, Sarah said as she lingered at the door after the others had filed out, I really am sorry if we hurt you. That was never my intention. Marcus looked at his youngest child, the one who had always been most openly affectionate, most obviously loving. The one whose actions had therefore been most painfully contradictory. "I know, Sarah," he said gently. "But sometimes our intentions matter less than our actions. And sometimes saying sorry isn't as important as understanding why it was necessary in the first place." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, and then followed her siblings down the hallway toward the elevator. After they left, Marcus's apartment felt strangely quiet. He moved to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline as the morning sun illuminated the mountains in the distance. For the first time in days, perhaps in years, he felt a sense of alignment between his external circumstances and his internal truth. He had spoken honestly, had established a clear boundary, and had refused to be manipulated back into patterns that no longer served him. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been comfortable. But it had been necessary, not just for his own dignity, but for the possibility of healthier relationships with his children going forward. His phone buzzed with a text from Walter, "First showing just finished. Potential buyers very impressed. Expecting first offer by end of day." The cabin sale was moving forward. His boundary was holding firm. And Marcus Reynolds was beginning to recognize himself again in the choices he was making. 3 days passed in relative quiet. Marcus continued his normal routines: morning coffee at the local cafe, volunteer work at the community center, evening walks around the neighborhood. But underneath the familiar patterns, something had shifted. A new certainty guided his decisions. A clearer sense of his own worth and the respect he was entitled to expect from others. Walter called on the third day with news. "We have 3 offers on the table," he reported, his voice reflecting professional satisfaction. "All at or above asking price. One family is particularly eager. They've included a letter explaining their vision for the property as a multi-generational gathering place." Marcus felt a bittersweet twinge at that description. It echoed his own original vision for the cabin, the dream that had motivated his purchase 20 years ago. A place where family could gather, where traditions could be built, where memories could be made across generations. "Send me the offers," he said. "I'll review them this evening." After hanging up, Marcus found himself drawn once again to the file folder of travel dreams he'd rediscovered days earlier. The Italian villas, the cooking schools, the language classes, possibilities he had set aside in service of constant family availability. With the cabin sale nearly finalized, those dreams were suddenly within reach. Not just financially, but logistically. Without the responsibility of maintaining the cabin, without the expectation of being perpetually available for family gatherings, he could actually consider extended travel. The thought brought a smile to his face and a lightness to his step. As he prepared for his regular volunteer shift at the community center, Eleanor was already there when he arrived, organizing donations for the center's food pantry. At 76, she remained vibrantly engaged in community service, her energy belying her age. "You look cheerful today," she observed as Marcus joined her in sorting canned goods. "Good news?" "Walter has 3 offers on the cabin," Marcus replied. "All at or above asking price." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That was quick. How are you feeling about it?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Mostly positive," he admitted. "There's some sadness, of course. 20 years of memories in that place. But also a sense of, I don't know, possibility? Like I'm opening a door rather than closing one." "Possibility suits you," Eleanor said with a smile. "Much better than the constant accommodation I've observed for the past 5 years. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Eleanor continued sorting cans, her movements efficient despite her arthritic hands. "Since I've known you, Marcus, I've watched you rearrange your schedule dozens of times to accommodate your children's needs. I've seen you drop everything for family emergencies that weren't really emergencies. I've observed you planning your entire life around being available whenever anyone might want your time or resources." Marcus felt a flush of recognition at her assessment. Had it been that obvious to others while remaining invisible to him? "And I've also noticed," Eleanor continued, "how rarely that accommodation flows in the other direction. How often your invitations are declined, your preferences overlooked, your availability assumed rather than appreciated." "I never wanted to be a burden," Marcus said quietly. "After their mother died, I was determined not to become the stereotypical demanding widower, always expecting the children to center their lives around my needs." Eleanor's expression softened. "There's quite a distance between demanding widower and doormat, my friend. Somewhere in that territory lies healthy mutual respect, which requires both giving and receiving." As they worked side by side, organizing donations and preparing care packages for community members in need, Marcus found himself reflecting on Eleanor's observation. For years, he had viewed his unquestioning accommodation as generosity, as good parenting, as the proper role of a father and grandfather. But what if, as Eleanor suggested, that one-way accommodation had actually undermined the very relationships he was trying to nurture? His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Can we talk? Just the two of us. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation." Unlike his interactions with Brian, Jessica, and Michael, which had primarily focused on the cabin itself, Sarah's message suggested a willingness to engage with the underlying issues. It was a small opening, but one Marcus was inclined to explore. "Of course," he texted back. "Coffee tomorrow morning at Harper's?" Her response came quickly, "Thank you. 10 a.m. works for me." After finishing his volunteer shift, Marcus returned home to find the formal offers from Walter waiting in his email. As promised, all three were at or above the asking price, with various contingencies and closing timelines. The letter from the family Walter had mentioned was attached to their offer, a thoughtfully written expression of their hope to create a legacy property where their extended family could gather for generations to come. Marcus read it twice, recognizing echoes of his own dreams from 20 years earlier. The family had 3 children and 4 grandchildren, with more on the way. They spoke of fishing competitions, of board game tournaments, of holiday traditions they hoped to establish. It was, in many ways, a mirror of what Marcus had envisioned for his own family when he had purchased the property. With a sense of both closure and opening, Marcus decided to accept their offer. There was something fitting about the cabin passing to a family who valued exactly what he had valued, who would appreciate exactly what he had hoped his own children would appreciate. He called Walter to convey his decision, then sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Sadness for what might have been, relief at having established a clear boundary, and growing excitement about the possibilities this change might create, not just financially, but emotionally and relationally. 4. Respect for his time and choices rather than assumption of accommodation. Small shifts that collectively represented a fundamental change in how his family related to him, and how he related to himself. The Italian cooking class the next morning was held in the kitchen of a local restaurant, a stone-walled space with copper pots hanging from overhead beams and an enormous wood-fired oven dominating one wall. 8 students gathered around a central workstation where Chef Paolo, a boisterous man in his 60s, demonstrated proper techniques for hand-rolling pasta. "Pasta is simple," he declared in heavily accented English. "Flour, eggs, olive oil, salt. But simple is not the same as easy. Simple requires attention, respect, patience." Marcus found himself nodding in agreement, recognizing wisdom that extended far beyond cooking. The simplest relationships, parent and child, friend and friend, often required the most careful attention, the most consistent respect, the most patient nurturing. For decades, he had believed that loving his children meant constant self-sacrifice, that good parenting required endless accommodation of their needs and preferences at the expense of his own. But what if that approach had actually undermined the very relationships he was trying to protect? What if true love required boundaries as well as generosity, respect for self as well as concern for others? "Now you try," Chef Paolo instructed, gesturing for the students to move to their individual workstations. "Remember, firm but gentle. Too much pressure, you damage the dough. Too little, it falls apart." Firm but gentle. The phrase echoed in Marcus's mind as he worked the pasta dough, finding the balance between necessary structure and flexible responsiveness. Wasn't that exactly what he was learning to do in his family relationships? Establishing firm boundaries while maintaining gentle connection. Creating enough structure to support healthy interaction without imposing rigid control. After class, Marcus walked back to his villa through the winding streets of the village, stopping occasionally to practice his Italian with shopkeepers and locals. 6 weeks into his stay, he had established a comfortable routine: language classes 3 mornings a week, cooking class on Thursdays, independent exploration on other days. His growing facility with the language had opened doors to experiences that would have been inaccessible to him as a typical tourist: invitations to local festivals, conversations with elderly villagers about regional history, recommendations for hidden restaurants and attractions known only to residents. Back at the villa, he checked his email as he did each Sunday, his one concession to regular digital connection during his Italian sojourn. Among the expected messages from friends and family was a surprising name: Brian's wife Linda. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." Curious, Marcus opened the message. "Dear Marcus, I've started and deleted this email a dozen times, never quite finding the right words. But after my conversation with Brian last night, I realized I needed to reach out, however imperfectly. I want to thank you for selling the cabin. That probably sounds strange, given how upset we all were at the time. But with 6 months of perspective, I can see now that it was the wake-up call our family needed, especially Brian and me. For years, we've been living beyond our means, making financial decisions based on expectations rather than realities. Brian's business struggles, the too large house, the private schools we couldn't really afford, all of it built on the unspoken assumption that you would always be there as our safety net. When you removed that safety net by selling the cabin, you forced us to face financial realities we'd been avoiding. The past 6 months have been challenging, downsizing our home, restructuring the business, making difficult decisions about priorities. But they've also been clarifying in ways I never expected. Brian and I are having honest conversations about money for the first time in our marriage. We're making decisions based on what we actually have rather than what we hope might come our way eventually. We're teaching our children values about financial responsibility that we ourselves had forgotten. None of this would have happened if you had continued accommodating our expectations. By saying no, firmly, decisively, unapologetically, you gave us the opportunity to grow up, even in our 40s. So thank you for having the courage to establish boundaries when it would have been easier to continue enabling patterns that weren't healthy for any of us. Enjoy Italy. You've more than earned it. With gratitude and new understanding, Linda. Marcus read the email twice, a complex mixture of emotions washing through him. Validation of his difficult decision. Sadness for the years of enabling patterns that had preceded it. Hope for the possibility of healthier relationships going forward. And something that felt surprisingly like pride, not in himself, but in Brian and Linda for their willingness to face difficult truths and make necessary changes. He replied simply, Linda, thank you for this message. It means more than you might imagine. Growth is rarely comfortable, but always valuable. I'm proud of the difficult work you and Brian are doing, and I look forward to supporting your journey in healthier ways when I return. With appreciation for your honesty, Marcus. After sending the reply, Marcus returned to the balcony with his journal, feeling a need to process the unexpected communication. The leather-bound book had become an important companion during his Italian sojourn, a place to record not just daily experiences but deeper reflections on the life changes he was navigating. He wrote about Linda's email, about the surprising validation from the person he had least expected to understand his boundary setting, about the liberation that came with establishing clear expectations after decades of endless accommodation, about the growing recognition that his self-respect and his children's maturity were interconnected in ways he hadn't fully appreciated before. The journal entry concluded with a question he had been considering with increasing frequency as his Italian adventure approached its halfway point: what next? The cabin sale had generated substantial funds, far more than required for this 3-month Italian sojourn. His Denver condo would always be home base, but the world had suddenly opened with possibilities he had never allowed himself to seriously consider. Spanish language immersion in Barcelona? Cooking study in Thailand? Cultural exploration in Japan? For the first time in decades, Marcus's future was limited only by his imagination and energy, not by his perceived obligations or others' expectations. It was both exhilarating and somewhat terrifying, freedom often was. The weekly family call that Sunday included a surprise participant. Brian joined Sarah and Michael on the scheduled video chat, his first voluntary participation since Marcus had left for Italy. Dad, he said when his turn came in the family updates, his voice carrying a new steadiness that Marcus hadn't heard in years. Linda mentioned she'd emailed you. I wanted to follow up personally, to say that everything she wrote, about the wake-up call, about the necessary changes, I feel the same way. Marcus nodded encouragingly, allowing Brian the space to continue without interruption. The cabin sale was difficult for me to accept, Brian admitted. But with some distance, I can see that it was exactly what needed to happen. Not just because of the financial reset it forced for Linda and me, but because of what it represented, your right to make decisions based on your own needs rather than everyone else's expectations. The acknowledgement was all the more meaningful coming from Brian, who had been the most resistant to recognizing the patterns that had necessitated such a dramatic boundary. Thank you for saying that, Brian, Marcus replied simply. It means a great deal to me. The conversation continued, weaving between everyday family updates and deeper reflections on the changes of the past 6 months. Sarah shared progress on the family cookbook project. Michael talked about a parenting boundary he had established with his teenage daughter, inspired partly by Marcus's example. Brian mentioned the business restructuring he was implementing, focusing on quality and sustainability rather than rapid growth. Throughout the call, Marcus was struck by a fundamental shift in the family dynamic. His children weren't just updating him on their lives. They were genuinely interested in his experiences, asking thoughtful questions about his Italian adventures, responding with enthusiasm to his stories and observations. The exchange felt balanced in a way their interactions rarely had before, mutual sharing rather than one-sided reporting. When the call ended, Marcus remained at the villa's small desk, reflecting on the conversation. The changes in his family relationships weren't complete or perfect. Jessica had been notably absent from the call, still maintaining some distance as she processed her own response to the boundary Marcus had established. The new patterns of interaction were still fragile, requiring conscious attention from everyone involved. But there was undeniable progress. His children were beginning to relate to him as a full person with legitimate needs and preferences, not just as a perpetual resource to be drawn upon without consideration. They were recognizing the relationship between their actions and his responses, between their respect and his generosity. Most importantly, they were growing, all of them, including Marcus himself. And perhaps it was time to start creating new memories, ones that centered his own happiness rather than his children's convenience. Walter's market analysis had suggested the cabin could sell for nearly $800,000. That was a significant sum, particularly for someone who had always lived modestly despite his financial stability. What would he do with that money? Where would it take him? For the first time in years, Marcus found himself considering possibilities that had nothing to do with his children's needs or expectations. Perhaps travel to places he'd always wanted to see. Maybe a smaller property somewhere warm for winter months. Investments that would support causes he believed in rather than family emergencies. The possibilities were suddenly wide open, limited only by his own desires rather than his family's demands. The signing of the listing agreement the next day felt ceremonial, a physical manifestation of his internal shift. Walter had brought all the necessary paperwork, professionally prepared and ready for his signature. "Once you sign," Walter explained, "the photographer will come tomorrow. We'll have the listing live by Friday. Given the current market, I wouldn't be surprised if we have offers by the weekend." Marcus took the pen, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was a declaration of independence. As he signed his name on the final page, Marcus felt a sense of finality. Of closing one chapter and opening another. The cabin had represented his dreams for his family. Now it would represent his commitment to himself. "Congratulations," Walter said, collecting the signed documents. "You're officially on your way to selling one of the most desirable properties on Blue Pine Lake." Marcus nodded, a mixture of emotions washing through him. Sadness for what he was leaving behind. Anticipation for what might lie ahead. And underneath it all, a growing certainty that he was making the right choice. The family vacation would end tomorrow. His children would return to their homes, unaware that the property they had so casually excluded him from would soon belong to someone else entirely. Someone who would hopefully value it, and the privilege of ownership, more than they had. As Marcus showed Walter out, he caught sight of his reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked different somehow. More certain. More defined. The accommodating father was gone, replaced by a man who understood his own worth and was no longer willing to accept less than he deserved. Eleanor was right. People treat you exactly as you train them to treat you. And Marcus Reynolds was about to change the training manual. Marcus stood at the window of his condo, watching the rising sun illuminate the Denver skyline. 3 days had passed since he'd signed the listing agreement, and Walter's prediction had proven accurate. The cabin had been photographed, listed, and was already generating significant interest. 5 showings scheduled for today alone, according to Walter's morning text. The family vacation had ended yesterday. His children had returned to their homes, their normal routines, perhaps already forgetting the weekend they'd spent enjoying his property without him. None of them had called since Sarah's awkward attempt at explanation. No messages asking about his week or sharing stories from their time at the cabin. The silence spoke volumes about the true nature of their relationship. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. Brian's name flashed on the screen, and Marcus felt a tightening in his chest. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to continue the silent treatment his children seemed so comfortable applying to him. But avoidance solved nothing. He had spent too many years avoiding difficult conversations for the sake of family harmony. "Hello, Brian," he answered, his voice calm and measured. "Dad, we need to talk." Brian's tone was urgent, almost panicked. "I just got a call from Todd Miller. You know, from the hardware store near the cabin? He said there were people taking pictures of the property yesterday. Professional photos. And a real estate sign went up this morning. Tell me that's some kind of mistake." Marcus moved to his kitchen table, sitting down with deliberate slowness. "It's not a mistake, Brian. You're selling the cabin?" Brian's voice rose in disbelief. "Without even discussing it with any of us? Dad, that property has been in our family for 20 years. We've been going there since the kids were babies. You can't just sell it on a whim." "A whim," Marcus repeated, the word settling between them like a stone. "Is that what you think this is? What else would you call it? One minute the cabin's our family gathering place, the next you've got it on the market without a word to any of us. What's going on with you? Marcus felt a flare of indignation at his son's tone, at the assumption that he needed to explain himself. At the complete absence of self-awareness about how his own actions might have contributed to this situation. What's going on, Marcus said evenly, is that I'm making decisions about my own property based on how that property is being used and valued by others. What is that supposed to mean? Brian demanded. It means that when I discovered all 4 of my children were using my cabin while deliberately excluding me from the gathering, I realized some reassessment was in order. Brian was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could almost see him calculating. His response, weighing different approaches to damage control. Brian had always been strategic, even as a child. It was what made him successful in business, and occasionally manipulative in personal relationships. Dad, I already explained that. It was just a casual weekend. Nothing formal. We didn't think. That's precisely the problem, Brian. You didn't think about how it would feel for me to discover through social media that my entire family was gathering at a property I purchased and maintained for family use, without me. So this is what? Punishment? You're selling the family cabin because your feelings were hurt? The dismissiveness in Brian's tone confirmed everything Marcus had been realizing over the past few days. In Brian's mind, perhaps in all his children's minds, his feelings were secondary. Inconvenient. Irrelevant to the real issues, which were always their needs, their convenience, their preferences. This isn't punishment, Brian. It's consequence. For years, I've made myself and my resources endlessly available to all of you. I've never asked for anything in return except basic consideration. And yet somehow, over time, that consideration has eroded to the point where you didn't even think twice about excluding me from a family gathering at my own property. Dad, you're blowing this way out of proportion. It was one weekend, it's not about one weekend, Marcus interrupted. His voice firm but controlled. It's about a pattern of behavior that's been building for years. It's about all of you taking my generosity for granted to the point where you don't even recognize when you're being disrespectful. Brian's tone shifted, becoming conciliatory. Look, if you're feeling underappreciated, we can talk about that. But selling the cabin is extreme. Think about the grandkids. Think about the family traditions we've built there. I have thought about them, Marcus said quietly. I've thought about them constantly for 20 years. I bought that property specifically for family gatherings. I maintained it for family use. I stocked it with everything anyone might need or want. And in return, I expected nothing except to be included in those gatherings. The line was silent for a long moment. What if we promised to include you going forward? Brian finally asked, his voice calculating. Would you reconsider the sale? Marcus almost laughed at the transparency of the offer. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a transactional proposition, future inclusion in exchange for continued access to the property. The property is already on the market, Brian. Walter expects offers by the weekend. Walter Chen? You listed with Walter? Brian's tone sharpened. Dad, if you're serious about selling, which I still think is a massive overreaction, at least let me handle it. My agency could get you a much better price than Walter. He's completely out of touch with current market values. And there it was. Brian wasn't concerned about losing the family gathering place. He was concerned about losing the potential commission on an $800,000 property sale. Once again, his self-interest was the primary driver of his reaction. Walter has been quite thorough, Marcus said mildly. His market analysis suggests the property will sell quickly and profitably. At least let me see the listing. I can tell you if he's underpriced it. You don't want to leave money on the table, Dad. I've made my decision, Brian. The listing stays with Walter. Brian's professional composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous. You're making a huge financial mistake because of some perceived slight. And you're punishing the entire family, including your grandchildren, because of one misunderstanding. Is that what you truly believe this is? Marcus asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. A perceived slight? A misunderstanding? What else would you call it? We had a weekend at the cabin. We didn't realize you'd want to come. End of story. Marcus felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. For days, he'd been wrestling with doubt, questioning whether selling the cabin was an overreaction. But Brian's response, the complete absence of empathy, the immediate pivot to financial considerations, the refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing, confirmed that he was making the right decision. Brian, I need to go. Walter is expecting my call about the showing schedule. The loss of the cabin was real and significant. But what he might be gaining, self-respect, healthier boundaries, more authentic relationships, was potentially far more valuable than any property, no matter how cherished or memory-filled. 6 months after the sale of the cabin, Marcus Reynolds stood on the balcony of a rented villa in Tuscany, watching the sun set over rolling vineyards that stretched to the horizon. The evening air carried the scent of ripening grapes and distant cooking fires, a sensory symphony so different from his familiar Denver surroundings that it sometimes felt like he had stepped into someone else's life. But this was his life now, at least for the 3 months he had committed to this Italian adventure. His. Chosen deliberately and lived fully, without constant adjustment to others' needs and expectations. The villa's phone rang inside, and Marcus smiled at the familiar timing. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork. He moved inside to answer, settling into the comfortable armchair beside the antique desk where he had been writing in his journal earlier. Ciao, he answered, the simple Italian greeting now coming naturally after weeks of daily language classes in the nearby village. Dad. Sarah's voice carried clearly across the international connection. How's the Italian adventure today? Marcus smiled, picturing his youngest daughter at her kitchen counter in Denver, probably preparing Sunday dinner for her family while catching up with her father. These weekly calls had become a cherished ritual for both of them. Magnificent. He replied honestly. I visited an olive oil producer today, family operation, for generations working together. The grandfather reminded me a bit of myself, except he speaks his mind without hesitation and expects everyone to accommodate his schedule rather than the other way around. Sarah laughed. Sounds like you're taking notes on assertiveness from Italian grandfathers now. They've elevated boundary setting to an art form, Marcus agreed. How are things at home? How are the kids? As Sarah updated him on family news, Cooper's soccer tournament, Emma's science project, Michael's work challenges, Marcus felt a familiar wave of love for his family. But it was different now, untangled from the resentment and hurt that had accumulated over years of one-way accommodation. He could love them fully while still maintaining the healthy distance necessary for his own well-being. And how's the family cookbook project coming along? He asked when Sarah paused for breath. This was new, a collaborative family project that had emerged organically in the months following the cabin sale. Sarah had proposed it initially, a collection of favorite family recipes, memories, and traditions that could be shared across generations even without the physical gathering place the cabin had provided. It's amazing, actually, Sarah replied, genuine enthusiasm in her voice. Everyone's contributing in different ways. Michael's scanning old photos, Jessica's organizing everything into sections, I'm testing and updating recipes. Even Brian is coming around, he sent in those pancake recipes you used to make at the cabin on Sunday mornings. Marcus felt a small but significant spark of hope at the mention of his eldest son. Brian had been the most resistant to accepting the cabin sale, the most reluctant to acknowledge his part in the dynamics that had led to it. For months, he had maintained a cool distance, his interactions with Marcus formal and infrequent. That's good to hear, Marcus said carefully. How is Brian doing? Sarah hesitated briefly. Better, I think. The business is still struggling, but he seems to be facing reality more squarely. He and Linda have downsized to a smaller house. He mentioned wanting to talk to you when you get back, something about financial advice for rebuilding. Marcus nodded, though Sarah couldn't see the gesture. Brian asking for advice rather than expecting rescue represented genuine progress. It suggested a shift toward viewing Marcus as a resource to be respectfully consulted rather than an endlessly available safety net. I'd be happy to talk with him, Marcus said sincerely. Financial rebuilding is something I know quite a bit about. They chatted for a few more minutes before saying goodbye, Sarah promising to email photos from Cooper's tournament and Marcus agreeing to send pictures from his upcoming cooking class at a renowned local restaurant. After hanging up, Marcus returned to the balcony with a glass of Chianti from a nearby vineyard. The sky had deepened to indigo, stars beginning to appear above the silhouetted cypress trees that lined the property's edge. In the distance, lights twinkled from the medieval village where he took his language classes 3 mornings a week. The past 6 months had brought more change than the previous 6 years combined. The cabin sale had closed quickly, the eager family with young children moving in just in time for summer vacation season. Marcus had finalized his travel plans, set up automatic bill payments for his Denver condo, and arranged for Eleanor to check on the place periodically during his absence. Most significantly, he had established clear expectations with his children about his availability during this period. He would check email weekly, have scheduled Sunday calls with whoever wished to participate, and could be reached by the villa's phone in genuine emergencies. But he would not be continuously accessible, would not rearrange his Italian experience to accommodate routine family matters, would not cut short his long-deferred dream to handle situations others could manage in his absence. To his mild surprise, Most of his children had respected these boundaries. Sarah and Michael had embraced the new dynamic enthusiastically, seeming to recognize that their father's happiness and independence benefited everyone. Jessica had been more reserved but pragmatic, adapting to the new reality with her characteristic efficiency. Only Brian had pushed back initially, making comments about responsibilities and family obligations that revealed how deeply he had come to depend on his father's unconditional accommodation. But even Brian's resistance had softened over time, especially as the consequences of his financial overextension became impossible to ignore. Without Marcus's safety net, Brian had been forced to make difficult but necessary changes, downsizing his house, restructuring his business, confronting the gambling habit he had successfully concealed from most of the family for years. It was painful to witness his son's struggles from a distance, but Marcus had come to recognize that his previous pattern of immediate rescue had enabled rather than resolved Brian's underlying issues. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do is step back and allow adult children to experience the natural consequences of their choices. The villa's phone rang again, interrupting his reflections. Marcus checked his watch, calculating the time difference. It was mid-morning. In Denver, unusual for a family call outside the Sunday schedule. "Hello," he answered, a slight note of concern in his voice. "Marcus, it's Eleanor. Don't worry, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to call and check how the Italian adventure is progressing." Marcus relaxed, smiling at the sound of his friend's voice. "Eleanor. It's wonderful to hear from you. Italy is everything I hoped it would be. How are things in Denver?" "Oh, the usual, book club dramas, building association politics. Nothing as exciting as your Tuscan escapades." They chatted easily, Eleanor updating him on neighborhood news and Marcus sharing stories about his language class misadventures and cooking experiments. It was the comfortable conversation of friends who understood and respected each other, without demands or expectations beyond the pleasure of connection itself. "I ran into Brian yesterday," Eleanor mentioned casually as their conversation was winding down. "At the farmer's market downtown. He asked about you, seemed genuinely interested in hearing how your trip was going." Marcus felt a small but significant warmth at this information. "How did he seem?" "Different," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "Less pressured, maybe? He talked about the business changes he's making, downsizing to focus on quality rather than expansion. He actually used the phrase, 'my father was right,' at one point, which I suspect doesn't happen often." Marcus laughed. "Not historically, no. He mentioned something else that caught my attention," Eleanor continued. "He said he's been thinking a lot about patterns lately, family patterns, relationship patterns. It reminded me of your conversations before you left." The observation struck Marcus as significant. Brian had been the most resistant to acknowledging the patterns that had led to the cabin sale, the most invested in framing the situation as an isolated incident rather than a symptom of deeper relational issues. "That's unexpected," Marcus admitted. "But welcome. Sometimes people need distance to gain perspective," Eleanor observed. "Both physical and emotional distance. Your trip may have given Brian the space to see patterns he was too close to recognize before." After saying goodbye to Eleanor, Marcus remained on the balcony, reflecting on how much had changed in 6 months. The cabin sale had been necessary, a concrete boundary that established his seriousness about changing long-standing family dynamics. But the real transformation had occurred in the subsequent months, as new patterns of interaction gradually replaced the old weekly scheduled calls. Instead of constant availability, mutual sharing of experiences rather than one-way reporting. I had to relearn how to prioritize myself. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a recognition of a truth he had been avoiding for years. He had built his identity around being the ever-reliable father and grandfather, the family financial safety net, the keeper of traditions. But in making himself so dependably available, had he inadvertently taught his children that his feelings were irrelevant? That his inclusion was optional? "So what did you do?" he asked. "After David died?" Eleanor smiled, a small, satisfied expression. "I stopped being so accommodating. I started saying no when I wanted to say no. I began putting my own needs first sometimes. And you know what happened?" "What?" "The people who truly cared about me adjusted. They respected my boundaries. The ones who were just using me, well, they drifted away. And I found I didn't miss them as much as I'd expected to." After Eleanor left, Marcus remained at his kitchen table, her words echoing in his mind. He thought about the cabin, about the 30 years of hard work that had gone into affording it. About the weekends he had spent renovating it himself. Installing the big picture windows that looked out over the lake, building the deck where his family now gathered without him. He had purchased that property as a legacy, a place where his family could continue to gather long after he was gone. But what was the point of building a legacy for people who didn't value your presence in the first place? Marcus's hand reached for his phone again, but instead of calling one of his children, he found himself searching for a number he hadn't used in years. Walter Chen, the real estate agent who had helped him purchase the cabin 2 decades ago. Walter Chen speaking. Walter, it's Marcus Reynolds. I'm calling about my property at Blue Pine Lake. The conversation was brief and to the point. Yes, property values in that area had increased significantly. Yes, Walter would be happy to provide a market analysis. Yes, given the location and the improvements Marcus had made, there would likely be multiple interested buyers. After hanging up, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. Not happiness, certainly not joy, but the steadiness that comes with taking control of a situation rather than letting it control you. The family vacation would end in 2 days. His children would return to their lives, perhaps already planning the next gathering from which he would be excluded. But things were not going to continue as they had been. Something fundamental had shifted, and Marcus Reynolds was no longer going to be the accommodating father whose feelings could be disregarded without consequence. For 35 years, he had put his family first. Had built his retirement plans around being near his children and grandchildren. Had structured his finances to provide for their needs and wants. Had made himself endlessly available. And somehow, in that process of constant giving, he had trained them to see his generosity not as a gift but as an entitlement. His presence. Not as valuable but as optional. Eleanor's words came back to him, people will treat you exactly as you train them to treat you. Well, the training was about to change. Marcus opened his laptop and began organizing his financial documents. The deed to the cabin. The maintenance records. The property tax statements. Everything Walter would need to move forward with the sale. As he worked, he felt something unfamiliar building in his chest. Not the hurt from earlier, not even anger, but something that felt strangely like strength. The kind of strength that comes from finally acknowledging a painful truth and deciding to act on it rather than continue pretending. His children had made their choice. Now he would make his. The email from Walter arrived the next morning, along with a comprehensive market analysis that confirmed what Marcus had suspected. The cabin's value had tripled since his purchase. The renovations he had made, the expanded deck, the updated kitchen, the additional bathroom, had substantially increased its appeal. In the current market, with inventory low and demand high, Walter estimated the property could sell within weeks, possibly days. Given the location and condition, Walter wrote, we could list as early as next week if you're ready to move forward. Marcus sat with that information, letting the implications settle. Selling the cabin wasn't just about responding to his family's exclusion. It represented a fundamental shift in how he viewed his relationship with his children, and his responsibilities toward them. For decades, he had operated under the assumption that good parenting meant constant sacrifice. That his role was to provide, to accommodate, to be available whenever and however his family needed him. He had never demanded reciprocity, had never insisted on respect, had never prioritized his own needs or feelings. And where had that approach led? To a family vacation from which he had been deliberately excluded. To children who could use his property while lying to his face about it. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Sarah, his youngest daughter, her name flashing on the screen. For a moment, Marcus considered letting it go to voicemail. But that would be avoidance, not confrontation. And he was done avoiding difficult truths. Hi, Sarah, he answered, keeping his voice neutral. Dad. How are you? Her voice carried the slightly too bright tone that Marcus now recognized as guilt. I've been meaning to call all week. Have you? Marcus asked mildly. I thought you might be busy. At the cabin, perhaps. A pause. Oh. You know about that. I do. Dad, it wasn't, we didn't. Sarah stumbled over her words. Brian said it would just be easier if you excluded me, Marcus finished for her. Yes, I imagine that was easier for everyone except me. We thought you wouldn't want to make the drive, Sarah said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. And you've been talking about your back problems, so we figured the sleeping arrangements might be uncomfortable for you. Marcus almost laughed at the transparency of the excuse. The drive to the cabin was barely 2 hours, a trip he made regularly without complaint. And he had specifically purchased a high-end mattress for the master bedroom last year to accommodate his occasional back issues. That's thoughtful, he said, not bothering to hide the irony in his tone. Though I managed to drive up there 3 weeks ago to stock the refrigerator and clean the deck furniture. My back seemed to handle that just fine. Another pause, longer this time. Dad, I'm sorry. We should have invited you. I knew it didn't feel right, but Brian said, Sarah, Marcus interrupted gently, I'm not interested in hearing about what Brian said or who made which decision. The fact is, all 4 of my children chose to use my property while deliberately excluding me. That tells me everything I need to know. What does that mean? Sarah's voice had shifted from defensive to worried. It means I'm reevaluating some things, Marcus said simply. Enjoy the rest of your vacation. We can talk when you get back. After hanging up, Marcus felt a strange lightness. There was pain still, certainly. Disappointment. A sense of loss for the family relationships he had believed in. But also a growing certainty that he was making the right decision. He picked up his phone again and dialed Walter's number. I'd like to move forward, he said when the real estate agent answered. Let's list the property as soon as possible. Walter's response was professional and efficient. He would prepare the listing agreement today. They could sign tomorrow. Photography would be scheduled for the following day. The property could be on the market by the end of the week. And, Marcus, Walter added before hanging up, for what it's worth, that's a spectacular property. Someone is going to treasure it the way it deserves to be treasured. The way it deserves to be treasured. The words echoed in Marcus's mind as he moved through his day. Wasn't that what everyone wanted, ultimately? To be valued. To be appreciated. To be treated with consideration. The cabin had been his gift to his family. But gifts could be returned when they weren't appreciated. Generosity could be withdrawn when it wasn't respected. That evening, Marcus found himself sorting through old photo albums. Pictures of family gatherings at the cabin over the years. His children as teenagers helping him build the dock. His daughters painting the kitchen cabinets. His sons installing the ceiling fans on the screened porch. So many memories in that place. So much love and effort invested. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he overreacting? Was selling the cabin too extreme a response to one excluded invitation? But deep down, Marcus knew this wasn't about one vacation. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been building for years. About the gradual erosion of his place in his own family. About the slow, steady transformation from valued father to convenient resource. His phone buzzed with a text message from Eleanor, checking in. How are you holding up? Marcus smiled, appreciating her concern. Taking action, he typed back. It feels better than I expected. Eleanor's response came quickly, good for you. Remember, setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary. Setting boundaries. The concept felt foreign after decades of having virtually none where his family was concerned. His time, his money, his property, all had been available to his children without restriction. Perhaps that unlimited access had led them to value it less. To value him less. Well, that was about to change. Marcus closed the photo album and returned it to the shelf. Those memories would always be his, regardless of who owned the physical property. The first time in years, perhaps decades, Marcus was making decisions based primarily on his own well-being rather than everyone else's expectations. It felt both foreign and deeply right, like rediscovering a part of himself that had been dormant for too long. His phone rang as he was preparing for bed. Michael's name flashed on the screen, and Marcus briefly considered letting it go to voicemail. But avoidance solved nothing, and eventually these conversations needed to happen. Hello, Michael, he answered, keeping his tone neutral. Dad, Michael's voice sounded strained, almost tearful. I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day. About patterns and consequences and I think you might be right. The admission caught Marcus by surprise. Of his 4 children, Michael had always been the most emotionally intuitive but also the most conflict avoidant. He typically followed the family consensus rather than establishing independent positions. I appreciate that, Michael, Marcus said carefully. What specifically resonated with you? The part about taking your generosity for granted, Michael admitted. About treating your availability as an entitlement rather than a gift. I started thinking about how often I've called you for help, with the kids, with the house, with money, and how rarely I've considered whether those requests were convenient for you or acknowledged the sacrifices you were making. Marcus felt a small flicker of hope at his son's self-reflection. This wasn't about the cabin specifically, but about the underlying patterns that had led to its sale, exactly the distinction he had been trying to establish. That's insightful, Michael. Thank you for sharing that with me. I can't speak for the others, Michael continued, but I want you to know I'm really trying to understand my part in this situation. And I'm sorry, not just for the cabin weekend, but for the pattern of taking you for granted that made that weekend seem acceptable in the first place. For the first time since discovering the vacation photos, Marcus felt a genuine sense of being heard. Not manipulated or managed, but actually understood in his legitimate grievance. That means a lot to me, he said sincerely. And it opens The door to a different kind of relationship going forward, one based on mutual respect rather than one-way accommodation. I'd like that, Michael said, his voice steadier now. I really would, Dad. After the call ended, Marcus sat in the quiet of his living room, processing the unexpected conversation. Michael's insight and apology didn't change his decision about the cabin. That boundary remained important and necessary, but it did suggest the possibility of growth and change in their relationship going forward. Perhaps the cabin sale, painful as it was in the moment, would ultimately serve as a catalyst for healthier family dynamics. Perhaps by finally saying no to patterns that no longer served him, Marcus was creating space for new, more reciprocal relationships to develop. It wouldn't be immediate or easy. Brian and Jessica, particularly, seemed resistant to recognizing their part in the situation, focused instead on preserving their access to the property rather than addressing the underlying disrespect. But Michael's call suggested that at least some of his children were capable of the self-reflection necessary for genuine change. As Marcus prepared for his coffee meeting with Sarah the next morning, he felt a cautious optimism. Not that everything would be immediately resolved, or that all his children would suddenly transform their understanding of their relationship with him. But that by establishing this boundary, by refusing to continue enabling disrespectful patterns, he had created the necessary conditions for potential growth. For decades, Marcus had believed that good parenting meant endless accommodation, that his role was to give without expectation of reciprocity or even basic consideration. But perhaps the most valuable gift he could offer his adult children now was the opportunity to develop genuine reciprocity, to learn that healthy relationships require mutual respect, that consequences naturally follow actions, that love does not negate the need for boundaries. Harper's Cafe was busy when Marcus arrived the next morning, the weekend crowd filling the small tables with friends and families enjoying leisurely breakfasts. He spotted Sarah immediately, already seated at a corner table with 2 coffee cups. Waiting. I ordered your usual, she said as he joined her. Black coffee, right? The small gesture of consideration, remembering his preference, ordering ahead, felt significant in the context of their recent conflict. A tiny acknowledgement of his personhood separate from his utility. Thank you, Sarah, he said, settling into the chair across from her. How are you? Sarah looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from emotional processing rather than physical exertion. Honestly? I've been better. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our family meeting at your place. Some pretty uncomfortable self-examination. Marcus nodded encouragingly but remained silent, allowing her the space to continue without interruption. You said something that really hit me, Sarah admitted, her fingers tracing patterns on the ceramic mug. About how saying sorry isn't as important as understanding why it was necessary. That stuck with me. I've been trying to really understand what happened with the cabin weekend, not just the surface actions, but the underlying attitudes that made those actions seem acceptable. Marcus felt a surge of pride in his youngest daughter's capacity for self-reflection. This was exactly the kind of consideration he had hoped for, not just regret for the consequences, but genuine examination of the patterns that had led to them. What have you discovered? He asked gently. Sarah's expression became troubled. That I've been operating on autopilot in our relationship for years. That I've been so focused on my own life, the kids, the house, work, that I've started treating you as a resource rather than a person. Someone who exists primarily to provide support when I need it, without needs or feelings of your own. Her honesty was both painful and deeply validating. Marcus had felt exactly what she was describing, but had doubted his own perception, wondering if he was being overly sensitive or unreasonably demanding. The cabin weekend wasn't an isolated incident, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the admission. It was just the most obvious manifestation of something that's been happening gradually for years. We, all 4 of us, have been taking you for granted in 100 small ways. Assuming your availability. Expecting your support. Accepting your generosity without reciprocation or even acknowledgement. Marcus reached across the table to cover her hand with his own. Thank you for saying that, Sarah. It can't have been easy to come to that realization. It wasn't, she admitted. And I'm not sure Brian and Jessica are there yet. They're still focused on the cabin itself rather than what it represents. But Michael and I have been talking, and we both want you to know that we hear you. We understand that this isn't about one weekend or one property, it's about patterns of disrespect that have developed over time. The validation of his experience was deeply healing. For days, Marcus had questioned whether he was overreacting, whether selling the cabin was an extreme response to a minor slight. Sarah's recognition of the underlying patterns confirmed that his boundary setting wasn't just justified but necessary. I've accepted an offer on the cabin, he said gently. From a family with young children who want to create exactly the kind of multi-generational gathering place I had envisioned 20 years ago. Sarah nodded, a mixture of sadness and acceptance in her expression. I figured as much. And while part of me is still grieving the loss of that place and what it meant to our family, another part understands that this is the natural consequence of how we've been treating you. We can't expect endless generosity when we've consistently failed to show basic consideration. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a releasing of tension he hadn't fully recognized he was carrying. Sarah's understanding didn't change his decision, but it eased the weight of it, confirming that he was establishing necessary boundaries rather than imposing arbitrary punishment. Where do we go from here? Sarah asked, her expression open and vulnerable. I don't want to lose our relationship over this, Dad. I want to do better, to be more considerate, to rebuild the trust that's been damaged. Marcus considered her question carefully. The cabin sale was proceeding, that boundary firmly established. But there were many possible paths forward for their relationship, paths that could lead to greater health and reciprocity if navigated with honesty and commitment. We start by acknowledging reality, he said finally. The reality of patterns that have developed, of expectations that have formed, of boundaries that need to be respected. And then we begin building something new, a relationship based on mutual consideration rather than one-way accommodation. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears but also with determination. I'd like that. I really would, Dad. As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Marcus felt a sense of cautious optimism. The cabin chapter was closing, a necessary ending to patterns that had become increasingly unhealthy. But new possibilities were emerging, for travel. Dreams long deferred, for relationships based on genuine reciprocity, for a life structured around his own well-being rather than everyone else's expectations. Or Greece. Places he'd always wanted to visit but had never prioritized. For the first time in days, Marcus felt something like excitement building in his chest. Not the grim satisfaction of standing his ground against his children's manipulation, but genuine anticipation for possibilities he'd long denied himself. His phone buzzed with a text message from Walter, 3 more showing requests for tomorrow. Strong interest from a family looking for a legacy property. Good signs. A legacy property. That's exactly what the cabin had been intended to be, a legacy for his family, a place where traditions could be built and memories made. But a legacy was only valuable if it was appreciated, if the recipients recognized its worth and honored the intention behind it. Perhaps his real legacy to his children shouldn't be a property they took for granted, but an example of self-respect they clearly needed to learn. The doorbell rang early the next morning, startling Marcus from his coffee and newspaper routine. Through the peephole, he saw all 4 of his children standing in the hallway, their expressions ranging from determined to uncomfortable. For a moment, he considered not answering. He wasn't prepared for a family confrontation before his second cup of coffee. But avoidance solved nothing, and eventually this conversation needed to happen. Good morning, he said as he opened the door, keeping his tone neutral. This is unexpected. We need to talk, Dad, Brian said, clearly appointed as the family spokesperson. All of us. Together. Marcus stepped aside, allowing them to file into his living room. The space suddenly felt crowded with the addition of 4 adult children, all radiating tension and unspoken agendas. Can I offer anyone coffee? Marcus asked, more out of ingrained hospitality than genuine desire to prolong the interaction. This isn't a social call, Dad, Jessica said, her lawyer persona firmly in place. We're here to discuss the cabin situation. The cabin situation, Marcus repeated, settling into his favorite armchair and regarding his children with a steadiness that seemed to unnerve them. What specifically about it would you like to discuss? The 4 exchanged glances, a silent communication system developed over decades of shared experiences. Finally, Brian cleared his throat. We've been talking, and we think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the weekend at the cabin. None of us intended to exclude you or make you feel unwelcome. It was genuinely a casual, last-minute gathering that just evolved. Marcus noted the careful phrasing, the way Brian positioned the exclusion as Marcus's perception rather than their action. The subtle shift of responsibility from their behavior to his reaction. I see, he said simply. Michael, his 3rd child and second son, leaned forward, his expression earnest. Unlike Brian's strategic calculation or Jessica's analytical approach, Michael had always led with emotion, sometimes genuine, sometimes performative. Dad, we feel terrible that you were hurt by this. We never meant to make you feel left out. Or unappreciated. You know how much the cabin means to all of us, how many memories we've built there as a family. The thought of losing it over one misunderstanding is just devastating. Again, Marcus noted the framing. His feelings were acknowledged. But the underlying action, their deliberate exclusion, was minimized as a misunderstanding. The real tragedy, in Michael's presentation, was not their disrespect but the potential loss of the property. "I understand the cabin holds many memories for all of you," Marcus said carefully. "That's precisely why I purchased and maintained it for 20 years, as a place for family gatherings. Family gatherings that, historically, included the entire family." Sarah, his youngest, had been silent until now, her eyes red-rimmed from what appeared to be recent tears. "Dad, please don't do this. The kids are heartbroken about potentially losing the cabin. Cooper asked just yesterday when we could go back to Grandpa's lake house to go fishing with you." The emotional appeal hit its mark, as Sarah had undoubtedly intended. Marcus felt a pang at the thought of his grandchildren, especially Cooper, his youngest grandson who had shown such enthusiasm for their fishing trips together. But he also recognized the manipulation inherent in Sarah's approach, using his love for his grandchildren to override his legitimate grievance with their parents. "I appreciate that the children enjoy the property," Marcus said, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "But this isn't about them. This is about the four of you making a deliberate decision to exclude me from a family gathering at a property I've provided specifically for family use." "Nobody deliberately excluded you, Dad," Brian insisted, though his eyes shifted away when Marcus met his gaze directly. "It just worked out that way." "Did it?" Marcus asked quietly. "Then explain to me why none of you mentioned the trip beforehand. Why Brian lied about where he was when I called during the weekend. Why none of you shared photos or stories with me afterward, despite posting extensively on social media. Explain to me how that sequence of events constitutes anything other than deliberate exclusion." The silence that followed Marcus's question was deafening. His four children exchanged uncomfortable glances, each seemingly waiting for another to offer a plausible explanation. When none came, the truth hung in the air between them, impossible to deny yet apparently difficult to acknowledge. Jessica was the first to attempt a recovery. "Dad, even if there was a lack of communication around this particular weekend, selling the cabin is a drastic overreaction. You're making a permanent decision based on one incident." Marcus studied his daughter's face, recognizing the negotiation tactic she often employed in her legal practice: concede a minor point to avoid addressing the larger issue. Acknowledge the lack of communication to distract from the deliberate exclusion. "Is it really just one incident, Jessica?" he asked quietly. "Or is it the culmination of a pattern that's been developing for years? A pattern where my availability, my generosity, my resources are taken for granted while my feelings and inclusion become increasingly optional?" For the first time, a flicker of genuine recognition crossed Jessica's face. A brief, uncomfortable awareness that perhaps there was truth in his assessment. "Dad," Michael interjected, his voice taking on the placating tone he used when trying to smooth over family tensions, "if you've been feeling underappreciated, we can address that. We can make more effort to include you in planning, to check in more often, to express gratitude for everything you do for us. But selling the cabin punishes everyone for what might be simple thoughtlessness on our part." "This isn't punishment, Michael," Marcus replied, the steady certainty in his voice surprising even himself. "It's consequence. For too long, I've allowed all of you to treat my generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. I've enabled patterns of behavior that have become increasingly disrespectful. Selling the cabin isn't about depriving you of something you value, it's about reclaiming my right to make decisions based on my own priorities rather than everyone else's expectations." Brian, ever the strategist, shifted approaches. "Dad, what if we made you an offer? The four of us could buy the cabin from you, market value, of course. You'd get the financial benefit of the sale, and the property would stay in the family." Marcus wasn't surprised by the suggestion. It aligned perfectly with what he'd come to recognize as Brian's primary concern: preserving access to the property while minimizing any need for genuine accountability or change. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus said, his tone neutral. "But the cabin is already on the market, with significant interest from several potential buyers. You could withdraw the listing," Jessica pointed out. "Nothing's finalized yet." "I could," Marcus acknowledged. "But I won't." Sarah, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "Why not, Dad? If this is about feeling valued and included, we're all sitting here telling you how much we value you and want you in our lives. Isn't that what you wanted to hear?" Marcus considered his youngest daughter's question, recognizing the genuine confusion beneath her frustration. In Sarah's mind, perhaps in all their minds, this confrontation should have a simple resolution. They would acknowledge his hurt feelings, promise to do better, and everything would return to the status quo. The cabin would remain available for their use, their traditions would continue unchanged, and their father's momentary assertion of boundaries would be smoothly managed and forgotten. What I wanted, Marcus said carefully, was not to be sitting here having this conversation at all. What I wanted was to be naturally included in family gatherings without having to demand it. What I wanted was for my children to recognize the relationship between generosity and gratitude without needing it explained to them as adults. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But since we are having this conversation, what I want now is for all of you to understand that this isn't about extracting apologies or promises. It's about recognizing that relationships have natural consequences. When you consistently take someone for granted, you risk losing their generosity. When you repeatedly exclude someone from the benefits of their own contribution, you risk them withdrawing that contribution. The four siblings exchanged glances again, a silent communication that excluded him even in this moment of supposed reconciliation. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Growing into more authentic versions of themselves, more honest relationships with each other, more balanced expectations of what family could and should provide. The cabin sale had been necessary, a clear, concrete boundary that could not be ignored or negotiated away. But the real value had emerged in the months that followed, as that boundary created space for new patterns to develop and healthier connections to form. As his Italian adventure continued, Marcus found himself increasingly comfortable with both the solitude and the selective connection his new life afforded. Mornings in language class, chatting with fellow students from around the world. Afternoons, exploring nearby villages or practicing his cooking skills in the villa's rustic kitchen. Evenings writing in his journal or sharing wine with neighbors on adjacent properties. Scheduled Sunday calls with family, now featuring varying combinations of his children depending on their availability and interest. It was a life balanced between independence and connection, between self-care and relational investment. A life that honored his needs without isolating him from meaningful relationships. A life that felt, for perhaps the first time since retirement, fully and authentically his own. 2 months later, as his Italian sojourn drew to a close, Marcus stood once more on the villa's balcony, watching his final Tuscan sunset. Tomorrow would bring packing in goodbyes, the beginning of his journey back to Denver and the life that awaited him there. But it would be a different return than any he had experienced before. He wasn't going back to resume his role as the endlessly accommodating father, the perpetual safety net, the support system whose own needs remained perpetually secondary. He was returning as Marcus Reynolds, a man who had reclaimed his right to set boundaries, to prioritize his own well-being, to expect respect from those who claimed to love him. The cabin was gone, sold to a family who would hopefully create their own legacy of meaningful gatherings and cherished memories. But what had replaced it was potentially far more valuable: the foundation for healthier family relationships, the reclamation of long-deferred dreams, the discovery of strength that came from standing firmly in his own truth. As the last light faded from the Tuscan sky, Marcus felt a deep sense of completion. Not because his journey was ending, in many ways, it was just beginning, but because he had finally recognized a fundamental truth that had eluded him for decades: the greatest gift he could offer his family was not his endless accommodation, but his authentic self-respect. By accidentally selling the cabin, he had deliberately reclaimed his life. And in doing so, he had created the possibility for relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-way sacrifice. For connections that enhanced rather than diminished his sense of self. For a future limited only by his imagination rather than others' expectations. The villa's phone rang one final time, and Marcus smiled as he went to answer, ready for whatever conversation awaited him, and whatever adventure might come next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.